Chapter 91 to 97. Harry Potter. Chad turned to find Ariel Almont walking towards him with a determined gait, already planning to make his morning more difficult. He had just sat down to eat his breakfast and was still half asleep. He purposely distanced himself from the Beauxbatons delegation at the feast last night so he would not have to deal with the snootiness of the males, or the questions from the woman now in front of him. Yes? Chad replied blandly to the French beauty. So you are him, how come you didn't tell me you were the Harry Potter? She asked, miffed at his lack of enthusiasm. It's more fun this way. Besides, your friends tainted my opinion of your school, so I wanted to have some fun. You made things rather boring by stepping in to save them. Ariel couldn't help but roll her eyes at his response. The boy's ego was greater than that of a wizard 10 times his age. I must say, the rumors surrounding you did not prepare me for meeting you in person. The poor little boy that returned to the wizarding world only 3 years ago portrayed in the newspapers is a far cry from the real you standing in front of me. She said, the unasked question all but asked. I told you I had a reporter friend, she has done wonders for my public image. Not to mention attacking my enemies. Enemies? You mean that half-giant responsible for your disappearance for 10 years? Hagrid? As if he was behind it, the man is as much a victim as I was. No, I meant Albus Dumbledore. Surely you heard of his trial and loss of positions? Chad replied, unsure why he was even bothering to respond to this girl's curiosity. It could have something to do with her large breasts, they were quite mesmerizing first thing in the morning, but not enough for him to reveal anything not publicly known. Or that he wanted to be broadcast in French noble cliques. Before Ariel could further milk Chad for answers, Lilith flew down with a screech that made those aware of her reputation shudder in fear. Dropping the morning paper in front of him and giving a peck for not visiting her more often, Chad could only pet his snowy owl and feed her some bacon as an apology. A collective gasp was heard throughout the hall, as those also subscribed to the Daily Prophet opened their copies. This seized Chad's attention and caused him to receive a light battering of Lilith's wing for ignoring her again. Amused at the bird's antics, he resumed patting her as he opened the paper with his free hand. The headline on the front page soon explained what had everyone gasping in shock. What did I tell you, Rita Skeeter knows how to stick at those she doesn't like. Chad said as he showed Ariel the paper. Oh, mon Dieu. He couldn't help but mentally pat himself on the back for his idea to brainwash the once hated reporter into an ally. She was worth her weight in gold. Curse that woman! Yelled an enraged Dumbledore. He swiped the remains of his breakfast off the table with his arm, frustration overriding his control as expensive tableware smashed to the ground, spilling their contents everywhere. Such was his fury that he didn't even bother to repair them, instead choosing to banish them into oblivion. The galleons needed to replace them would be more than the Weasleys would earn in months. It had become something of a trend for the leader of the Light to lose his usual calm demeanor as he broke his fast, and just like all the times before, the cause had been the morning Daily Prophet. The headline on the front page was something that would take years for his reputation to recover from, let alone fix completely. What made matters worse, was that there were elements of truth in the article that could be verified by the few witnesses he had not purged. Grindelwald's girlfriend, why the leader of Light never married. And it seems as though Rita Skeeter had managed to interview 2 of them. Both his brother, Aberforth, and Bathilda Bagshot, his childhood neighbor and Gellert's great-aunt had both spilled the beans to the now highly acclaimed reporter and future Lady of House Black. Damn that wretched woman and her poisonous quill. It seems she needs to experience the consequences of opposing me. A few years in Azkaban for being an unregistered animagus should do the trick. Albus thought menacingly, a cruel smile overtaking his usual genial bearing. What really annoyed him though, was that Rita had used her position at the Daily Prophet to advertise her book. The article was the equivalent to a book's blurb, and then directing her readers to flourish and blots if they wished to read the full story. The fact that he needed to pay the woman slandering him to find out what the full details of said defamation were made him press harder than necessary as he penned the anonymous tip to the head of the DMLE concerning Skeeter's illegal beetle form. Amelia Bones needed to suppress the laughter that threatened to escape as she read the familiar flowing script of the anonymous letter informing her of an unregistered animagus. Did Dumbledore forget that she often saw his handwriting in an official capacity thanks to his former positions of office? Either way, it was clear to her that the man was clearly angry when he penned this letter. He had even nearly managed to poke through the thick parchment in some places. What sealed the identity of the author was also the timing. She had also read this morning's Prophet and had been tempted to buy the infuriating woman's book. Maybe she could get Skeeter to send her a copy for free now that they had a working relationship. When they sat down together to go over her story concerning the robbery at Hogwarts, Skeeter had proposed to continue the partnership in return for a small favor. It seems the woman knew this would happen eventually and had prepared for it well. How Rita managed to get her name onto the Animagus register without everyone knowing was suspicious in itself, since there were only a total of 7 known registered animagi in the 20th century. But since she was technically registered, Amelia had agreed to keep it quiet in return for help in their investigations. Knowing there was a reporter that could turn into a beetle to overhear conversations would damage her information-gathering abilities. Luckily, no law required announcing that an animagus had registered, and having the woman owe her a favor was well worth not starting rumors out of revenge about how the journalist got her scoops. Throwing the self-righteous old fool's letter into the trash, Amelia couldn't help but let a burst of laughter slip out as she thought what Dumbledore's face would look like as he eagerly waited for news or Rita Skeeter's arrest. "Everything all right, boss?" asked trainee Tonks, investigating the strange noise she heard from the open door of her boss's office. Madam Bones just stared at her with her patented frosty glare until the nervous teenager's hair turned to blush pink in embarrassment. Taking the hint, the trainee backed out, closing the door as she went. "I must be hearing things, there is no way the boss would be laughing." Tonks thought as she went back to her desk, "Best to forget all about this, Moody might make me work harder if he hears I was causing trouble." Throughout magical Britain, those that had a subscription to the Daily Prophet were either delighted, shocked, appalled, sad, furious, or a mixture of them. But the one emotion everyone that read Skeeter's article universally felt was curiosity. Just what did she write in her book? Flourish and Blots received a tidal wave of customers that just could not resist satisfying their curiosity. Even Gilderoy Lockhart's book signing didn't attract half as many witches and wizards as Rita's new book did. If it was one thing the wizarding world thrived on, it was gossip. Harry Potter had been on the receiving end of public opinion fueled by gossip his whole life in the original timeline, going from hero to villain, and then back more times than a sane person could imagine. But this was wizards we were talking about, and one thing that was rarely attributed to the magical humans of this world was sanity. Chad had been well aware of this and had suggested Skeeter wait until they had a large stockpile of books before releasing it. Gellert Grindelwald was a worldwide Dark Lord, unlike Voldemort who barely spread his influence out of Britain. And if there was one thing the public would flock to read, it was the sordid past of 2 of the most famous wizards of this century. By the end of the first day of the book being sold, it had already eclipsed any of Lockhart's fantasy novels disguised as non-fiction. By the second, it had outdone all of his stories combined. Rita Skeeter had set the wizarding world aflame with the hottest gossip it had seen other than the emergence of a new Dark Lord. And she had profited massively from it. Time flew by quickly, with little happening that was of interest to Chad. Other than minor annoyances, things were pretty much normal, well, as normal as a magical school for children could get. Ariel Almond had continued to pester him excessively, so much so, that he had prodded Hermione and her fan club into action. They had strict non-interference rules that dealt with situations like this. Safe to say, the proud French which paid no heed to their warnings of following the Harry Potter fan club rules. That was until she had nearly every witch in Hogwarts pelting her with stinging hexes every time her back was turned. It only took 2 days for her to admit defeat, join the fan club, and insert herself in a position adjacent to Hermione. Even the other Bosbatten witches that had held off approaching Harry Potter because of Ariel's social hierarchy, and the threats associated with her influence, had joined the fan club for the benefits. Now that they no longer had to fear retribution from Ariel, they had eagerly joined the group that had many profile pictures of the pretty boy that had filled their dreams. Honestly, Chad could only blame the medieval mindset of the wizarding world that would see 17-year-old girls lusting after a 13-year-old boy. Though admittedly, his new height made him pass for an older student, so maybe that helped them see past his young age. Either way, keeping his distance from girls in school was much less problematic than if he just gave in and started banging them all. As enjoyable as that would be, having multiple pure-blood parents after him with marriage contracts for deflowering their daughters would be troublesome. Not to mention the emotional baggage that would come from all the catfights involved with him having numerous sexual escapades. The amount of mind magic he would have to throw around would leave way too much evidence that could be traced back to him. He didn't want to be exposed as dark before his grip on the wizarding world was complete. Or near enough that it wouldn't matter. With his women problems solved, for now, the only other thing irking him was that Ronald Weasley's bravado was back in full force. Hell, it had even stepped up a notch with Gryffindor supporting him. Any guilt that Chad had felt for entering him a potentially lethal competition evaporated like a 40-year-old, still unmarried woman's dreams of romance. The kid had no sense of self-awareness at all. At the weighing of the wands, Rita Skeeter had interviewed all the contestants properly since she was now a legit journalist instead of a gossip columnist. Since there was now 4 competitors in a tournament explicitly named for 3, she had asked Ron if he was worried about the selection error or that his young age would put him at a disadvantage. Course not, us Gryffindors are fearless. Besides, I can't let Hogwarts be represented by a slimy snake. Safe to say, that fearlessness only lasted up until he received a letter from his dragon handler brother. Skeeter had then asked McGonagall what school was listed on Ron's application into the Goblet of Fire, considering the boy had just claimed to be representing Hogwarts. I'm afraid I don't remember. Came her obviously fake reply, her eyes not able to meet Rita's. I see, then I'm afraid I will have to inform the people that you have violated the trust of those that entered the Triwizard competition by cheating and purposely interfering with a magical contract. What? I did no such thing. So you did not purposely omit the name of the red-headed boy's listed school? The goblet chooses participants from each school, for there to be a fourth school must have been entered. This is your last chance to not be branded a cheat and a liar. Skeeter bullied the usually stern and rule-abiding woman with public character assassination. McGonagall muttered something unintelligible. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Skeeter prompted. I said Dumbledore's School of Boy Toys. The now angered woman ultimately admitted. With that exasperated admission, some of her fierce Scottish nature finally showed through the meek personality that had been prevalent until now. Whether it was a side effect of Dumbledore's conditioning or her finally getting a backbone was uncertain, but it was enough for Rita to back off. She had what she wanted anyway. The morning paper once again caused the dining hall of Hogwarts to erupt into frantic gossip. Chad took great delight in seeing Ron's face turn redder than his hair from either embarrassment or rage. He cared not which one, they were both equally hilarious. With Ron knocked down a peg or 10, things got back to normality. Hogsmeade weekend came and went, with Chad having to sacrifice half of it at the 3 broomsticks, entertaining the 10 lucky witches other than Hermione and Ariel that had won the right amongst their fan club for a date. Small allowances to keep the romantic situation under control was tolerable if it brought him peace. But the day Chad was eagerly awaiting had finally arrived. It was the day of the first task. And boy was he conflicted over it. On the one hand, he couldn't wait to see Ron and the French Ponce humiliated, but on the other, Ron was most likely going to be maimed and or killed. It was almost guaranteed. Unlike Ken and Harry, Ron did not have a fast-racing broom to summon if he had managed to learn to do so, nor did he have any outstanding skills to utilize. Unless his brother had been training him in how to deal with dragons, the insult, fire crotch, that Malfoy had been calling him, would become a reality. After lunch, the crowd had assembled in the arena set up to witness the first task, and Ludo Bagman introduced how the champions would compete. Spoiler alert, it involved stealing a golden egg from a nesting mother. What interested Chad however was the order the champions would compete, and the dragons they would face. Turns out, Bagman was only too happy to tell everyone. Victor Crumb, Swedish Shortsnout. Miles Bletchley, Common Welsh Green. Ronald Weasley, Chinese Fireball. Losh Couture, Hungarian Horntail. Chad felt he may have jinxed the poor Weasley reject with all the talk of being engulfed in fire. The Chinese Fireball was notorious for the sizable mushroom-shaped flame it shoots from its mouth when angered. Luckily for Ron, it was more tolerant than other dragons. Unfortunately for Ron, it was only tolerant of its own kind, it was rather aggressive to everything else. Victor Crumb was first up and used the conjunctivitis curse to blind the dragon and retrieve his egg just like he would have done a year later in canon. Though since the Shortsnout had a scorching fiery breath, it was a closer call than when he had faced the Chinese Fireball, finishing with singed clothes and the slight smell of burnt hair. Miles Bletchley had used much the same tactic, but being a Quidditch player himself, he had chosen to transfigure 5 large birds to distract the Welsh Green while he retrieved his egg with a summoned broom. It was strange that Crumb didn't think to do the same. Finally, with great anticipation, Chad watched as Ronald Weasley stumbled out of the champion's tent as though his legs were made of jelly. He had to give the annoying boy some credit, he had actually turned up to face a dragon, and that took a certain amount of bravery. The redhead jogged quickly to just out of the Chinese Fireball's range, took out his tattered wand, and cast something Chad was surprised he knew. A 4th-year spell, the Summoning Charm. Accio Sleeping Draft. Yelled Ron. He had pointed his wand at the dragon keepers standing off to the side, ready to jump in to restrain the dragon if something went wrong. How he knew that they had a vial each of the potion, was a mystery. It was almost as though he knew that's what they had used to transport the dragons into the country in the first place. That they always kept it on hand in case of emergencies. What a coincidence. Still, however he found out, it was clear he was new to using the summoning charm since instead of one veil of potion, he had somehow managed to make 5 of them fly towards him at speed. Catching one of them and doing his best to dodge the others, he was still hit in the face by 2 of them. But luckily for him, the vials were spelled to be unbreakable. Otherwise, he might have put himself to sleep if they had broken. Chad was disappointed to see that Ron would now pass the first task effortlessly, but at least he got a giggle out of watching him being smacked in the face. His curse of pain was still audible to the crowd, even though he was so far away. Ron then used a bit of basic spell work and his snowball fighting skills to make balls of mud, dose them with the potion, and then banish them at the dragon's face. 2 mud balls missed, but 3 others went down the beast's throat after it roared from copping one in the eye. With the extra potions on hand, Ron didn't need to be too worried about accuracy, but surprisingly, he did quite well. Nearly immediately, the pissed-off dragon quieted down and then collapsed to the ground. Ron gave a whoop of joy, and conscious that he was being timed, made a mad dash for the golden egg. Like most predators, dragons had a low cunning, they needed 2 if they wanted to survive in the wild. Even a dragon bred in captivity knew a few tricks since many dragon keepers were injured, crippled, or killed on the job. Unfortunately, it seemed that Charlie Weasley had failed to make his brother aware of this. A ball of fire was spat at him when he was in range, before the dragon finally slumped to the ground once again, fully asleep this time. In his eagerness to get a faster time, Ron had run straight into the trap. Though it seems his idiot's luck had held true once again since the mama dragon had been barely conscious when it made its final attack to protect her clutch of eggs. The fireball had lost most of its usual power than if the dragon was at full strength. Though even drastically reduced in power, it still managed to set his robes and hair on fire. Ron ran around like a madman. Primal fear had hijacked his sense of reason and caused him to yell and scream instead of instantly removing his clothes. Or use magic. Chad couldn't help but think of a video he saw before being sent to this world as he watched Ron run around in fear. It was just like the BLM rioter that had his shoes catch fire. Instead of kicking them off, he ran around like a lunatic, his body's reflexes sending him mixed signals that didn't help at all. How the hell was lifting your knees up as high as you could protect you from your feet on fire? The other rioters around him were not much better, trying to stomp on him to put it out. Fight or flight reflexes were supposed to keep a person alive, but since we had lived such sheltered lives, they ended up just overriding reason and causing us harm. Finally, in his mad struggles, Ron had somehow managed to tear his robes off in his panic. The hushed crowd that had thought him in danger couldn't help but burst out laughing now they knew he was going to be okay. Chad couldn't help burst out into laughter himself as he looked at the youngest Weasley male standing there in his underwear, completely bald. Someone must have cast a General Akbar curse on him, cause he just walked into a trap and turned into a bald, red humanoid. He joked aloud. Unfortunately, there were no Muggleborns around to get the reference. Ron was carted off for medical treatment as soon as he had grabbed the egg. After removing his robes and running out of hair to burn, the poor bastard had gingerly walked past the sleeping dragon to end the task. He was walking with care for 2 reasons. The dragon was scary as hell and had just set him on fire after playing dead, and 2, he had just been set on fire and was in extreme pain. Chad had to give credit where credit was due. Ron finished the first task even while in pain and people were laughing at him. Burns are the worst injury to have in Chad's opinion, but luckily for Ron, they lived in a world of magic. An ointment and a spell or 2, and the annoying little *T would be back running around Hogwarts bragging about how he had defeated a dragon. Chad dismissed this train of thought as the final challenger of the day stepped out of the tent ready to face the Hungarian Horntail. This guy definitely got the short end of the stick in the dragon he had to face. Since this Ponce was one of those that couldn't even cast a charm to keep himself warm, Chad wondered how Lâche Couture planned to get past the Hungarian Horntail to retrieve the fake egg. Chad doubted the French wizard was capable of thinking outside the box, so he would probably choose a straightforward method. Miles Bletchley had tried to cast a few spells with no success before summoning his broom, so he had probably been trying to just call the golden egg directly to him. It made sense that there would be some sort of protection from such spells. Wizards were notoriously lazy and dependent on magic for everyday convenience. Using magic to bring an object to you would be the first thing they thought of. But there were still a few ways he bet that even the organizers didn't think of, like asking a house elf to retrieve it or transfiguring animals to bring it to him instead of walking into the range of fiery death. When the Beauxbatons students started to try and sing the ferocious dragon to sleep, Chad couldn't help but look down on the French school. Just as Fleur had done in canon, now this guy was trying the exact same method. Was this headmistress Olympe Maxime's influence at work? It was mentioned in the books that she had told Fleur of the dragons. Did she also come up with the plan to complete the task? Chad thought it must be so because here he was watching a man lullaby an aggressive Hungarian horntail to sleep. One thing was for sure, Chad would much rather be watching a pretty girl sing falsetto than this poncy bastard. Though, to be fair, a manly baritone probably wouldn't suit whatever magic was being performed to put the beast to sleep. The crowd was hushed as the supposed male worked his magic, and incredibly, it succeeded. The boy still continued his song even after watching the dragon slump to the ground, not stopping just because it had worked, but also making sure it continued to do so. Walking forward cautiously, Lâche Couture picked the egg up with ease, far faster than any competitor before him. It was as if he was on a Sunday stroll and not facing a fearsome fire-breathing dragon. This impressed the crowd so much that they unanimously stood up and roared out their approval, clapping and cheering the boy's success. Lâche Couture basked in the tumultuous applause until he heard movement behind him. Even though he was still singing, the noise from the crowd had broken whatever slight hold he had over the magical creature. Before those watching could even cry out in alarm, the Hungarian horntail had lashed out with open jaws. The behemoth's maw swallowed the unfortunate boy to his waist before the large dagger-like teeth clamped down. The gruesome scene made Chad unconsciously recollect Jurassic Park, where the T-Rex bit the lawyer in half off the toilet. Realizing things had gone pear-shaped, the dragon handlers moved in to restrain the dragon, pelting it with spells and potions of sleeping draft. Either it was contact-based, or the wizards had acted in a panic since the dragon's mouth was already full, and there was no chance of the liquid going down the horntail's throat unless it was with its current meal. They had the dragon down and out remarkably quick, but it was already far too late to save Lâche Couture. He was gone as soon as the dragon woke up from the sudden burst of cheering. Chad disliked the boy, but even he thought death was a bit too harsh a punishment for being rude to him. Then again, he had just conquered a country for pretty much the exact same reason, so he wouldn't be losing any sleep over it. He also found the next hour far more entertaining than the tournament itself, as Madame Maxime went berserk on everyone even remotely official looking. Anyone involved in this barbaric competition, as she loudly called it, was going to be hearing from the French ministry. Unfortunately for her, he was pretty sure nothing would come of it since everyone had signed contracts, and the international tournament had been somehow approved to go ahead. Her own country's ministry included. The Triwizard tournament was renowned for its high death count, and Madame Maxime had just witnessed why. The wizarding world had an astonishing lack of logic and common sense, not to mention very little thought for the consequences of their actions. Though Madame Maxine's outburst may have not been so extreme if Ludo Bagman hadn't asked whether they still needed to give a score for the French chap's performance or not. By the time the half-giantess had finished raging at the man, it was clear that the Beauxbatons students would not be staying much longer. She had quickly gathered the remaining French students to her and sent them to their magical flying carriage. She recovered what was left of Lâche Couture, harnessed the horses, and flew away without so much as a farewell. The exodus had happened so fast that even a tearful Ariel was shepherded away before she could say goodbye. This spoke either of the anger of the Beauxbatons headmistress, or her hypocrisy. There was no interschool unity on her mind now after her student's death, and her furious departure did not speak well for her diplomatic skills. If a tragic accident was enough to destroy any semblance at unity, the entire matter was doomed to fail from the start. Amazingly, during this whole disastrous situation, not one teacher had thought to herd the students away from the scene of a gruesome death. Though many had left on their own volition, most still stayed to watch on as the remains of the boy were collected, and the huge headmistress went ballistic. Chad had assumed that it was mostly Dumbledore behind the reasoning for not supplying traumatized children help after near-death experiences in canon. But it seems it was a mindset shared with all wizarding authority figures. Watching a dragon eat someone was treated like just another Tuesday at the school that had set Harry Potter on his way after being bitten by a basilisk. There was also killing Quirrell, torture by blood quills, attacked by a werewolf, watching Cedric Diggory die, and many other examples. And that was just Harry. Everyone was eventually shooed off back to the castle so they could clean up the site of the competition. Those that had decided to stay and stare in morbid fascination after the fourth champion's demise, happily walk away chatting over gruesome details. There was something seriously wrong with the mentality of the wizarding world. If this was a Muggle school, the place would have been shut down, the kids removed to see psychiatrists, and a full investigation launched into how it was allowed to happen in the first place. But that was the difference between modern society and its updated morality compared to a medieval one. Death was less of a game stopper when you see it more often, even with a smaller population. How they could be so laid back after going through 2 civil wars within 50 years, and then letting a third one happen with so little resistance, was mind-boggling. Then there was the blatant disregard of life with regards to the Muggle-born gulags. Rita had covered the first task and made little mention of lack of government oversight, mentioning only that dragons were not an acceptable challenge for school children. Though she did have a dig at the French lack of backbone. Magical Britain was wholly unconcerned with the accidental death of a French wizard. Hogwarts was back to normal everyday life by the next morning. Even the Durmstrang delegation didn't seem fussed, joining in with their English counterparts in deriding the French for leaving. With Chad having nothing to do with the Triwizard Tournament, he wasn't really bothered about any negative fallout or future tasks. His involvement in entering students into the competition didn't even raise any eyebrows, so why would he care if the Beauxbatons were upset? Well, he did miss perving on the female students, but not enough to motivate him to help change events or be proactive in assisting the champions in surviving their trials. No, if anything was bothering him, it was how Remus Lupin was no longer looking lost after failing to enter Harry Potter into the Goblet of Fire. Dumbledore must have come up with a new plan. Chad spent the next few days wondering what Dumbledore's new plan could be. He had Hagrid, the 2 Crouch men and Remus at his disposal, but what could he do that would bring him back into relevance? A Death Eater attack on the boy who continued living? Barty Crouch Jr. doing a solo Death Eater run down Diagon Alley or at the Triwizard Tournament for media exposure? The Yule Ball was coming up, was there some plan to expose Voldemort using a fake? Chad couldn't take the risk of being dragged into some half-baked scheme that Remus Lupin seemed to find doable by the relaxed disposition he showed lately. The easiest way to solve the problem was to remove Lupin from the board instead of waiting to see whatever he had planned. Tomorrow was the 29th of November, and it just happened to be the full moon. All it took to reduce Chad's stress levels by half was to send in an anonymous tip that he had seen Fenrir Greyback dwelling in the Shrieking Shack. It was too dangerous to ignore considering its proximity to Hogwarts and the full moon shining brightly. But just in case they decided to ignore it, he had a backup plan. Rita Skeeter had received the same anonymous tip since she would keep the Aurors honest like she had done with Black's case. It was a mere incidental occurrence that he happened to notify the Aurors of this fact in his letter. Aurors seek Fenrir Greyback, catch werewolf teacher instead. It turns out that a motivated Auror force was surprisingly effective. As Chad read the Morning Prophet and chuckled at Skeeter berating Lupin's selfishness and McGonagall's failure to protect the students, he couldn't help but marvel at the outcry from the students for Lupin's plight. It seems that just like Canon, he was a much-loved professor and praised for his ability to make his class fun, yet informative. But the students touting him as the best dada teacher they've ever had were just comparing him to Lockhart. Although Auror Blintley wasn't a barrel of laughs, his lessons were just as solid as Lupin's, if not better at covering the coursework. That he clearly didn't want to be there, yet still taught the material effectively bespoke the horrendous abilities of his predecessors. But either way, Chad couldn't give 2sh*ts if his fellow classmates were sad at the man's arrest and subsequent firing from his position at Hogwarts. The law was quite clear on werewolves and their proximity to children, after all, and Chad could do without an enemy plotting on him. But Dumbledore's scheming in the shadows had given him enough of a scare that Chad thought it would be better to bring the old bugger into the spotlight again. Maybe some proof of Voldemort's return, or at least his Death Eaters. It was something he had on his list of things to do, but not for a few more years yet since they were not going anywhere. It was time to jailbreak Azkaban and forcefully recruit some new magical minions. Although there were only 10 high-security Death Eaters imprisoned at Azkaban, Chad planned to empty the entire place. He intended to eventually control every magical person on Earth to stop them starting a war with the Muggles, so why leave the other prisoners there? A week later, late at night, 10 masked men appeared in the air just outside of the anti-apparition Jinx on Azkaban. Chad had tested to see if his elves could bypass the wards, but unfortunately, the prison had been created when the little guys were prevalent, and thus accounted for. The outskirts of the island was the closest they could drop him and his team of wizards. Chad had not wanted to use ninja elves for this mission just in case they were exposed, so he had some of his Australian indenture wizards visit for a week. Off the books, of course. Unshrinking their brooms as they plummeted towards the ground, they were soon swooping down silently on the unsuspecting guards. One of the men tried the door unconsciously, forgetting that they were breaking into a high-security facility. Much like when the power goes out, and you still try to turn the lights on or use the microwave without thinking. Chad was just about to berate the idiot when the door actually opened. It was not locked. The main entrance into Magical Britain's most notorious prison that housed its worst criminals was unlocked. This was going to be easier than I first thought. Chad assessed the mission. Giving the man holding the door open a nod of acknowledgement, he swished his flamboyant robes and headed in after 2 of his men. The dimly lit hall eventually opened into a common room of sorts where 3 Aurors were playing cards and listening to the wizarding wireless network. What the? The Auror facing the door cried out before going for his wand. Unfortunately for him, Chad and his cronies had the element of surprise and their wands already in their hands. A disarming charm hit each of the guards, in some cases multiple times, as cries of Expelliarmus filled the room. Dumbledore, what is the meaning of this? Shouted a guard picking himself off the floor and feeling naked without his wand. I have no idea what you mean, my boy. I'm certainly not Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, the greatest wizard of all time. Replied the masked man in bright, flashy robes with long white hair and beard not hidden at all by his mask. His voice sounding like the famous wizard was also just a coincidence. I can assure you that I am merely a Death Eater here to free my companions. The not Dumbledore Death Eater continued as he raised his wand and stunned the guards into unconsciousness. Okay lads, just like we planned. Stun and portkey everyone here, work in pairs and watch out for Dementors. Chad ordered his men after the witnesses had fulfilled their roles. They then moved through the prison going from floor to floor stunning prisoners, throwing a timed portkey that would transfer them to a holding cell, and moving to the next section. Any Dementor that tried to intervene was harassed with a Patronus that would chase them away while his partner took care of the prisoner. Chad spent the entire time hunting Dementors with his dragon Patronus, though he had to limit its size thanks to the lack of room in the hallways. He had a few theories on the supposedly unkillable immortal beings of doom and gloom, and he couldn't wait to test them out. The first was obviously cornering a Dementor and having his Patronus eat it. Why would an unkillable soul-eating creature of darkness run scared from a spell if it was impossible to kill them? The answer was that their invulnerability was severely exaggerated. The reason Dementors ran was that the projection of positive feelings was harmful to a creature of negativity. When they couldn't escape, the wraith-like being gradually dispersed into nothingness under the continual assault of its anathema, its core being's opposite emotion. Chad had wondered how the world was not overrun by the soul suckers if they were unkillable. Surely they would be unstoppable and at the top of the food chain if that was the case. Imagine how powerful a Dementor would become if it could suck the soul out of a dragon. With the success of his first test, Chad was even more excited to perform the second one. It was every boy's fantasy to wield a sword and fight off enemies, and Godric Gryffindor's sword coated in basilisk venom was even cooler than his childhood self could ever imagine. Even more so when he was using his mind to fly it around the hallways of the dread prison and skewer floating wraiths of despair. If basilisk venom could destroy Horcruxes that were nothing more than entrapped souls, then what effect would it have on a Dementor that existed to feed on them? The answer turned out to be nearly a minute of agonizing pain until exploding in a small shockwave of dark mist. It was much more dramatic than using his Patronus, and not at all as safe. Where the Dementor would try to flee his glowing dragon of positivity, they would bum rush him with the poison sword still in their wraith-like chest. How a Dementor could be both unsubstantial and substantial at will was quite mind-boggling. Were they like a dark version of a poltergeist? If so, could Peeves be also done away with using the basilisk's venom? The answer was probably yes, but Chad didn't hate Peeves enough to test it out. Maybe if the prankster ghost pissed him off enough one day. 15 minutes later, one of his men came and reported the mission complete. Chad had only been able to kill off 8 Dementors and had no idea how many actually resided in this dreary fortress. Looking at the next target that he had cornered, he thought he may as well scare them into staying put instead of wasting who knows how much time hunting them all down. Let this be a lesson to you. I know how to kill you. I can kill you easily. If you ever leave this island, you will be slaughtered. Tell your friends, because ignorance will not stop me wiping out you parasites if you fail to heed my warning. After threatening the cowering creature that was supposed to everyone's nightmare, he gave the signal and him and his men winked out of sight via portkey travel. With his house elves as go-betweens to organize tonight's adventure, Chad had only been gone from his room in Hogwarts for less than an hour. As he tucked himself into bed, he couldn't help but imagine what tomorrow's headlines will be. Dumbledore wanted evidence of Death Eater re-emergence and to be back in the spotlight. Let's see how he reacts after getting his wish. Just as Chad expected from his latest stunt, *T hit the fan. But it did not go entirely to plan. The Ministry went into lockdown mode when the Azkaban guards awoke and notified them of what happened. Thankfully, they were not eaten by Dementors and able to pass on what they saw. Which was quite lucky, since Chad had forgotten to set up any protection for the 3 guards after he stunned them. With an empty prison and no one to feed on, the Dementors must have been craving to eat the only mouth-watering morsels left on the island. The guards being helpless would have just multiplied their desire. If Chad had to guess why they didn't, it would be because they had just witnessed the death of 8 of their number, and didn't want to piss off the only people that could possibly protect them from him. That, and having everyone as enemies instead of just him must have registered as unwise in whatever passes for a brain for the magical creatures. Fudge had filled his pants at the thought of a re-emergence of Death Eaters led by Dumbledore and had promptly ordered the entire Auror force to defend the Ministry of Magic headquarters. The absurd man had taken great delight in cutting down Dumbledore as a political opponent and securing his position as Minister of Magic. But while he respected the old man's personal magical power, Fudge didn't fear him. Only his influence as the leader of the Light faction caused him concern. The only reason he was not as scared of Dumbledore as he was of Voldemort was because he believed the soft-spoken, self-righteous pacifist would follow the laws. The report of a Dumbledore-fashioned Death Eater had made him fear the second coming of a Dark Lord. This was where things deviated from Chad's expectations. He had believed his throwing shade at Dumbledore by using an illusion of his image and speaking patronizingly would just cause the old man a few problems. Dumbledore would be called in to answer questions and would be able to easily prove his innocence. He had only planned to limit the old man's influence and damage his credibility with rumors, but he had forgotten all about Fudge's inability to act rationally to irregular situations. Just like in canon, when he sent Hagrid off to Azkaban, a full trial for Harry, sending Dementors to a school, Barty Jr. killed before questioning, sending Umbridge to Hogwarts, or any of his other ill-thought-out plans, his reaction was ridiculous. The man could only be relied on to do the exact opposite of what you expected him to do. He had to be seen doing something, after all, and this coupled with his fear turned into a massive overreaction that now had the magical community bracing for another civil war. Well, that was a slight exaggeration, but Dumbledore's hardcore followers were up in arms, and it mainly had something to do with every media source assassinating Dumbledore's character. While there had been a total media blackout to not cause chaos throughout magical Britain for the first 2 days after the breakout, when they reported on the story, it was only to label Dumbledore as going rogue. Chad had assumed that the first 2 days of hearing nothing from his escapades had been because of Madame Bone's influence, and her wanting to investigate properly before jumping to conclusions and creating more problems for herself and the Aurors. But when the Daily Prophet had flown in with his snowy owl on day 3, it was plain to see that Fudge had overridden her caution with his penchant for being a retard. Mass breakout of Azkaban, Death Eaters on the loose. Fudge blames Dumbledore's jealousy over Minister of Magic position. Manhunt for Dark Lord Dumbledore. While the rest of the dining hall was in shock over the news, Chad was equally shocked, but for a different reason. He couldn't believe how blown out of proportion his plan had become. This was a government that had released known Death Eaters because they had claimed they were under the Imperious curse. Surely they would believe trickery before labeling the man they praised as the leader of the Light as an irredeemable villain. There were plenty of ways to disguise a person's appearance with magic. How could they automatically think the worst of a man they hailed as a hero? It wasn't until Chad read Rita's article calling Dumbledore a Dark Lord that he understood just how Fudge had lost his mind. Since he had recruited her under his mysterious pureblood persona, he had been filling her head with caution towards Dumbledore, and tempering it with damning information of the man's past. How he suspected Dumbledore of killing his own sister. How he had been Grindelwald's lover and co-conspirator in the Wizard World War. How he betrayed his own love for fame and social status. How he had created Lord Voldemort. How he tried to do the same to Harry Potter. But most importantly, how he was behind Sirius Black's incarceration. Chad had eventually slowly rewritten Rita Skeeter's mind to forget her earlier employment from a shadowy benefactor that made her the most eligible bachelorette. By the time he was finished, Skeeter was made to think it had been her own initiative that had started her investigations that led to meeting the love of her life. Gone was her greedy nature, to be replaced with the most crucial part of her new personality, her love and devotion to Sirius Black and Harry Potter. And the main danger to the 2 most important people in her life was a man she had secret personal and very damaging information on. For some reason, she had planned to slowly release books damning Dumbledore's reputation and profiting heavily off of it. But now that he had shown his true colors by breaking out prisoners, Skeeter had gone nuclear. The first thing Rita did when she figured out why the ministry was locked down, was to head over to Fudge and tell him everything she knew. For a price, of course. It was evident from her article that their fear and hate for Dumbledore had fed off each other and morphed into the full-on destruction of Dumbledore's righteous persona and the manhunt now underway. Never mind that Dumbledore could wipe out a full team of Aurors by himself, or that the man had a brainwashed group of followers. They just decided to tell the whole of magical Britain that Dumbledore was a Dark Lord and the enemy of the Ministry of Magic. They didn't stop to think what such a declaration would unleash. Chad could only curse to himself by the time he had finished reading the damaging articles that hinted at everything Dumbledore was guilty of. The once again references to a book release had him gobsmacked at Rita's audacity. He should have put failsafes in her mind to only reveal certain information when prompted, but he was sure that his timeline for exposing Dumbledore would be enough. He had failed to factor in the emotions of her new attachment to Sirius and himself would affect her. He could only blame himself for this oversight, and while it would only be beneficial for him in the long run, it would also cost him way more trouble short term. The whole reason why he was drip-feeding the wizarding world Dumbledore's hidden secrets was so he could gobble up the man's political influence. He had yet to even talk Sirius into using the sympathy for his wrongful stay at Azkaban as a means of running for Chief Warlock, since Marchbanks was as old as dirt and wouldn't fight him for the position. Dumbledore was the glue holding the political factions together, whether it was out of admiration or fear. Chad's greatest cheat power from being inserted into this universe was his foreknowledge, and even though he threw it out the window with his involvement, it was only when it benefited him. Suddenly removing Dumbledore would only cause a power vacuum and create untold complications. Hell, if he wanted Dumbledore out of the way, he could have easily killed the old bastard when he had first trained up his ninja elf army. When he had 50 or so teleporting, blade-wielding, fanatically loyal suicide bombers, why would he worry about one old man working from the shadows? No. What Chad had always cared about was his long-term goals. This was his new life, it wasn't a game. If he was only here for a specific time limit, he probably would not have started trying to enslave everyone capable of exposing magic to the Muggles. Why would he care if they found out when he could just leave after completing his mission? R.O.B had said nothing about returning him to his old universe, only that he would get a wish if he completed his purpose for being inserted into the body of Harry Potter. He viewed this life as his only life now, and would not give up his new powers and position for anything unless it was in his best interest to do so. Sure, he missed the few people he called friends, but he had only a few distant relatives left after his parents had passed away. There was also the fact that he had been killed in his old life. If he wanted to undo it, he would have to use his wish changing that. It was simply not worth it to him. He could always make new friends and start a family of his own. There was no way Chad was going back to being an ordinary Muggle when he was already in a position to control an entire world both financially and magically. Besides, Chad was way too selfish to give up his new life for old drinking buddies, and the sense of loss he would experience from losing his powers would sour any relationship he had with his friends. He would end up resenting them each time he remembered the thrill that came whenever he used magic. He was pretty sure R.O.B was not nice enough to combine multiple factors into a single wish and would take great pleasure in twisting his request into something entertaining for himself. No, this new reality was now Chad's main one, and he quite liked how it had turned out so far. While this latest development would significantly increase the difficulty level of his plans, it was not untenable. Mostly because Chad was not in the center of the trouble. As far as Dumbledore was concerned, Harry Potter was still a naive child ready to be manipulated. Albeit, Harry was a lot smarter than he first thought and surrounded by people teaching him things that would make it harder for Dumbledore's first plan to come to fruition. If Chad was really lucky, this new Dark Lord situation would make Dumbledore forget all about Harry Potter. Hopefully, it would make him devote his time to finding Voldemort, who he must think is the engineer of his current dilemma, or concentrate on clearing his name. Chad needed to rethink his entire plans now that things had spiraled out of control. But at the end of the day, magical Britain was mainly for his own entertainment. If he needed to, he could completely overwhelm any opposition if he concentrated the full weight of his power and influence on it. His men conquering Africa's magical society required no further direction since they just had to keep slowly enslaving families one at a time without being exposed. Slow and steady would eventually win the race, and once they finished there, South America would be next. His Muggle world enterprises were still on track, and although they would gain attention every now and then from governments or competitors, magic went a long way to solving those problems. Making it seem that people were bought off was simplicity in itself with near unlimited resources and mind magic. If a potential enemy made too much of a nuisance of themselves, there was also more permanent solutions. Australia still continued to have a few complications but was mostly under control. Though after thinking of possible oversights when reviewing perhaps his greatest mistake, he had remembered something that could have saved him a lot of effort. The Philosopher's Stone required souls, and Chad had needed to kill off a lot of people thanks to overextending himself trying to become a king to sate his ego. Why on earth did he not feed them to the glowing red stone of immortality? With Dumbledore's outing of being a suspected Dark Lord, mundane things like the Triwizard Tournament and the Yule Ball took a major back seat to the chaos erupting in the wizarding community. Even Hogwarts was rife with conflict as people chose sides and lines were drawn in the sand of where people stood on the matter of Albus, Percival, Wulfric, Brian, Dumbledore. Things only got worse when Rita Skeeter released her latest book that put her last one to shame in controversial insights into Dark Lord Dumbledore's life. Funnily enough, even without Chad's influence over her latest book, it ended up being named the same as her hit piece in canon. The Life and Lies of Albus Dumbledore. Stripping away the popular image of serene, silver-bearded wisdom, Rita Skeeter reveals the disturbed childhood, the lawless youth, the lifelong feuds and the guilty secrets Albus Dumbledore kept hidden from the world. The book covered everything from the destruction of his family in his childhood by Muggles and using it as motivation for his turning dark, to his present manipulations of Harry Potter to further his desire for fame and power. Even though Rita had used a lot of speculation, it was filled with enough facts to paint a very damning picture. And the wizarding world was not known for their loyalty to heroes, it was almost like they enjoyed seeing those they worshipped brought low and then destroyed. But this time, it was not Harry Potter they turned on. Though, just like how Harry Potter retained a few loyal, light, families to help him out in times of need, Dumbledore still had his faithful followers. It was pure coincidence that they were the same families that followed Harry Potter in canon, and surely not because Dumbledore told them to do so. Chad had watched how even the Gryffindor house had turned on the Weasley siblings and a few other die-hard, light, families for sticking up for Albus, I give children sweets Dumbledore. Hufflepuff had also been seriously affected as a quarter of their house was also included in the pro-Dumbledore faction. Hufflepuff's loyalty seemed to be very selective. The whole of Slytherin was positively gleeful and continued to throw fuel on the dumpster fire that was Dumbledore's reputation. They laughed happily as even people on the fence about the current situation were dragged into the collateral damage of their allegations. If someone tried to defend Dumbledore or even just asked to wait for confirmation of his guilt, they were tarred with the same brush of veritable hatred aimed at the man that used to be worshipped as a hero. It was a political cleansing, and the Slytherins were taking advantage of the situation to smear their political enemies or settle scores. The Durmstrang students just sat back and watched the entertainment, their headmaster enjoying himself immensely from watching the turmoil. The only house that was basically untouched by the drama was Ravenclaw. They were mostly unbothered by the events that had the wizarding world riled up since Dumbledore no longer had anything to do with their studies. That was until Rita's book questioned his motives in cutting out a lot of the Hogwarts curriculum and subjects, dumbing down what wasn't removed, and the selection of professors to teach them. Then they were decidedly anti-Dumbles. If Snape's behavior hadn't changed and his teaching improved drastically over the last couple of years, he would have been dragged into the current *T show hitting Hogwarts. It seemed to be gathering more momentum than Chad had ever thought possible with Dumbledore's previous vice grip on the magical community. But with backing from Slytherin alumni coupled with distance from Dumbledore after his removal from school, Snape had managed to deflect a lot of the resentment. Teachers like Binns and Trelawney were not so lucky, and parents and ex-students campaigned for their immediate removal. Who wouldn't be upset at the imagined loss of power and knowledge after it was pointed out to them that Dumbledore had maliciously denied subjects to keep them ignorant? Never mind that the purebloods and the Ministry also had a hand in it, or that the average wizard or witch couldn't even cast the Patronus charm because of lack of interest in schoolwork. When Rita pointed out Dumbledore's nefarious schemes to influence their education, they were out for his blood, and nothing would persuade them differently. To make matters worse, Dumbledore had yet to make an appearance to dispute the claims, merely using his Order of the Phoenix members as emissaries to plead his innocence. This could have had something to do with Fudge's arrest on site orders. Word had gotten out that he had been pushing for a kill order, but Bones had threatened mutiny if he didn't give suspects a fair trial. The last thing she wanted was sentencing more innocent people like Sirius Black to a lifetime in Azkaban. Or just killing them outright. Not wanting to lose the support of the Aurors, Fudge could only grudgingly agree. Still, support for Fudge and his campaign against Dumbledore was at an all-time high, and Rita was fueling the flames with her book. Muggleborns had tried to rally for their most prominent supporter in the government. That was until they were made aware of his childhood views of wizards' rule over Muggles and his hand in Grindelwald's rise to power. The icing on the cake was when the Ministry released evidence of just how many proposals for Muggleborn equality laws were squashed under his reign over the Ministry of Magic as Chief Warlock, and the voting bloc he controlled. Many dark families happily came out to piss on the remains of his reputation by admitting they were threatened by the powerful dark wizard into voting his way on specific issues. Rita and Fudge had started the anti-Dumbles snowball rolling, and it had gathered so much momentum that it didn't ever look like stopping. Without something colossal happening, Dumbledore's political career was over. Of course, when the all-powerful manipulator figured that out, it was the reason why Harry Potter received a knock on his door to be suddenly summoned to the headmistress' office. Professor Flitwick had personally come to get him late one night after a few of the top brass had used the flu to have a meeting with McGonagall in her office. "What's this all about, Professor?" Chad asked his head of house. "I'm not sure, Mr. Potter. Some people from the ministry have arrived and asked to speak with you. Come along quickly now, we shouldn't keep them waiting," the diminutive Professor of Charms replied. Following behind Flitwick, it didn't take long before Chad found himself in McGonagall's office across from Cornelius Fudge, Amelia Bones, and a man he didn't recognize. McGonagall was also there. "Thank you, Phileas," McGonagall said, clearly dismissing the messenger. "Ah, Harry, good to see you again," said Fudge enthusiastically as soon as he walked in, even taking the initiative to walk over and shake his hand. When Flitwick had closed the door on his way out, Chad went to work. He needed to find out what was going on and to try and steer himself away from whatever drama this clearly intended to suck him into. "Minister Fudge, a pleasure to meet you again. Is this about my family's property? I thought my godfather was handling that," Chad said, putting everyone off balance and drawing attention to the fact that his guardian was not present. "Ah, not quite," started Madam Bones, but Chad cut her off. "We should probably wait for him to get here then. We don't want to have to repeat everything again once he arrives. This is a bit of a delicate situation, Mr. Potter. It would be safer if fewer people knew about what we discuss here tonight," McGonagall suggested. Chad could only curse in his thoughts. Dumbledore must have made a play to deflect all the hate for him at another target once again. "I don't see what is so secretive about my school work. Sure, I'm at the top of my class, but others are doing just as well as me. Is this about some award?" Chad threw out some more word vomit to irritate everyone. "Mr. Potter, this is quite serious. We have come into some information that there are greater events than what we first thought regarding your childhood." Amelia Bones tried to start getting to the point once again, but Chad was having none of it. "Wait a minute, if this is about my personal circumstances and has nothing to do with school, why are we having this conversation in front of a school teacher and a man I don't know? Mr. Potter, I am your headmistress," McGonagall said with her authoritative tone before Chad cut her off as well. "So, this apparently has nothing to do with Hogwarts and is so secretive that not even my godfather is included. What makes you so special?" The old woman spluttered indignantly, and Fudge actually barked out a short laugh. No doubt he was unsure why he involved the headmistress in the first place, other than it had become a habit with Dumbledore's tenure because of his other titles and positions. "The boy's right. I'm sure you do a fine job running Hogwarts, Minerva, but this is official ministry business, even if it is a load of codswallop. Dumbledore is just trying to distract us from his crimes," grumbled the Minister of Magic, taking pleasure in putting down Dumbledore and a prominent supporter. When even Madam Bones gave a grudging nod of acknowledgement to Chad's point, McGonagall's face scrunched up in displeasure, and she mimicked Flitwick's exit. Bones' no-nonsense temperament had finally had enough, and she got straight to why this meeting was happening. "Now, Mr. Potter, if you are entirely finished, this is Daedalus Diggle. He has been Dumbledore's go-between in protesting his innocence and has finally offered proof of why he could not possibly be a Dark Lord and is being framed. What do you know of prophecy, Harry Potter?" "What do I know of prophecies? I know they are extremely unreliable because of how vague they are, and end up being self-fulfilling in nearly every case. Not to mention that they usually only make sense after the fact since events can be cherry-picked to fit the prophecy." Chad, clearly annoyed at Dumbledore's effort to force him into his last resort to save his schemes, was making his stance on divination clear. He didn't buy into them. "Ha! The boy is smarter than you, Amelia. I can't believe you are actually taking this seriously. Dumbledore is wanted for criminal activities as well as harboring other wanted criminal suspects. He is just deflecting attention away from his actions so he can remain free and commit more atrocities," crowed Fudge in triumph after Chad's scathing opinion on the integrity of prophecy. "We checked the Hall of Prophecy, and there was clearly an orb there, just like Dumbledore said. The least we can do is check it for evidence, and Dumbledore will still need to prove his innocence." Amelia Bones replied calmly, only a slight twitching of her left eye revealing her annoyance at Fudge's remarks. "Wait just a minute. Are you saying my name is on one of your prophecies and Dumbledore knew about it? Why did he reveal it only now, and why do you need me?" Chad asked, knowing full well the answers. We need you because the orbs are magically protected so that only the subject or subjects of the individual prophecy can lift them off their stand. Dumbledore no doubt only told us to save his skin, he hoards information like goblins hoard gold. Amelia informed him. And my name is on this orb that can only be removed by those named? Well, not exactly. What happens if someone picks up the orb and is not part of the prophecy contained in the orb? Chad kept rapid-firing questions at the woman that seemingly had no qualms about involving him to prove Dumbledore's innocence. Either she was a stickler for justice, which was most likely, or something more nefarious was afoot. But the head of the DMLE that he heard rumors of would not exclude Sirius Black from this conversation since he was Harry Potter's guardian. Secrecy be damned. Anyone else who attempts to inspect the orb with their hands would be afflicted with instant madness, added Fudge, taking delight in watching Chad put Bones on the back foot. But that's a risk Amelia is quite willing to take on the orders of a man she should have arrested by now. Chad couldn't believe it. Fudge had said something helpful for once. As annoying and stupid as the man was, Chad was starting to see why Lucius Malfoy kept him around. He was the perfect mouthpiece when directed correctly. Chad made a show of pulling out his wand. Even though he kept it pointed at the ground, the meaning was clear. The adults in the room couldn't help but become defensive at the move and placed their hands on their own wands. They still had enough intelligence not to draw them on a child, though. Let me get this straight so that when my godfather brings you up on charges in front of the Wisengamot, Madam Bones, they will be accurate. You come to my school, isolate me from everyone, and then demand that I retrieve a prophecy orb that doesn't have my name on it? An orb, that if not about me, will turn me insane. All on the orders of a man heavily suspected of kidnapping me as a child, illegally imprisoning my godfather, and breaking Death Eaters out of Azkaban? Is that everything, or have I missed something? You forgot that Dumbledore is also harboring Hagrid and Crouch. Fudge helpfully supplied, even if it had nothing to do with charges that could be brought against Amelia Bones. Amelia Bones was not under any compulsions, nor was she on Team Dumbledore. But she had let her blind pursuit of justice seriously cloud her judgment. She clenched her jaw in anger, and her eyes took on a dangerous glint. Chad was suddenly worried for a second, his earlier concerns of her being under a compulsion being the main reason he took out his wand. Thankfully, the anger seemed to direct it at herself for blindly charging forward, looking for clues. My apologies, Mr. Potter, I had overlooked the danger our investigation may have put you in. Rest assured that you do not have to do anything that you don't want to, and we can contact Sirius Black if you wish him to be present. Amelia apologized sincerely, not even trying to make excuses for her mistakes. Chad was glad his earlier impressions of the woman had proven correct. The woman had just had a sudden bout of wizard stupidity. It happens to the best of wizards, and even Chad had caught a case of it when he entered Hogwarts for the first time. Putting his wand away to show his acknowledgement of her words, Chad couldn't help but use the situation as a chance to take another dig at Dumbledore. I also apologize for my harsh words, the circumstances had put me on edge. Anything with Dumbledore's involvement needs to be faced with a wand in hand. The scope of the man's manipulations have only been slightly uncovered by Ms. Skeeter, and are decades in their construction. Now wait just a moment. Dumbledore is innocent, and it is unfair to attack him without any evidence, let alone use that vicious woman's lies as proof. He is trying to keep you-know-who from returning and save the wizarding world once again. I thought the boy who lived would want to help defeat the man that killed his parents, not try and put him in jail. Interjected the man in the room that had remained silent until now. Chad glanced over at Daedalus Diggle, a member of the Order of the Phoenix and Dumbledore's current errand boy. What has he done so far? What? The man responded, confused. I asked what Dumbledore has done so far to prevent the return of a man everyone thought dead for the last 10 years. Chad reiterated. He defeated you-know-who in the first place. Diggle cried out in complaint. I thought that was me. Or at least that is what everyone keeps telling me. Well, yes, but Dumbledore and the Order of the Phoenix had battled the Dark Lord since he first appeared. Your parents were also members. Yes, Sirius told me a bit about that. Didn't Dumbledore order that any spells that had a chance to be lethal were never to be used, even in self-defense? Wasn't that why so many of the members of his group died? It's almost like he wanted to lose the war. Chad remarked, happily throwing more shade at Dumbles even if his face only showed confusion and naivete. As the man failed to come up with anything other than greatest wizard or leader of light, Chad added another question that would not put Dumbledore in the best standing. When did Dumbledore say this prophecy was made, who heard it, and by whom was it spoken? To say Fudge was having the time of his life watching Dumbledore's reputation being destroyed by a child many had thought his protégé, would be an understatement. And when he heard the latest question, he couldn't help but gleefully arm the boy with more information. Dumbledore didn't say, spouting nonsense about protecting their identity, but the initials S.P.T were on the prophecy orb. He had no problem giving my name though. What a steadfast defender of the innocent. S.P.T, surely there can't be that many people tied to divination with those initials. Wait a minute. The divination teacher here at Hogwarts is named Sybil Trelawney. What's a bet her middle name starts with a P? Chad pretended to figure out. Both Bones and Fudge's eyes lit up at the obvious answer. Now that it was in front of them, they couldn't believe they had not thought of it earlier. Where else would Dumbledore hide his prophet other than right under his crooked nose? Excellent work, my boy. Amelia, if you wouldn't mind, would you please go and see if the woman knows anything? I will keep Harry company while we wait. As for you, Daedalus, I think that you have confirmed we are taking this seriously and justice will be done. There is no longer any need for you to be here, declared Fudge, once again showing uncharacteristic qualities of a leader. Amelia gave a stiff nod of acceptance, marched a babbling Mr. Diggle to the floor, and then went to track down the drunken divination professor once the protesting man left in a flash of flame. Fudge waved his wand around and cast a few more privacy spells than what had already been put up by Amelia when they first arrived. Due to the supposed sensitive topic, the headmaster portraits in the office had already been put to sleep. Now Harry, after what Miss Skeeter has told me, and what I just witnessed, I'm sure I can count on you to help against Dumbledore's madness. The man has to be stopped, but I'm afraid his popularity is quite ingrained in our community. Your endorsement would go a long way to seeing him brought to justice. Of course, Minister, Rita and Sirius have already explained to me just how much that old goat has ruined all our lives. Just send a letter to my godfather, and he will be happy to set up something public. I'm glad to hear it. Dumbledore needs to be stopped, and if it wasn't for Rita Skeeter, who knows if he would have even been exposed. Remarkable woman, Rita, if only I were many years younger and not married. I might have fought your godfather for her hand. Chad had been expecting Fudge to get him on board so he could use his fame as a weapon against Dumbledore's own, especially if this prophecy bullsh *T kicked off. But while he had him alone, Chad may as well arm Fudge with a few talking points that would prohibit the need for Chad to get personally involved. Mr. Fudge, my question from earlier was never answered by that Diggle character. If Dumbledore knew about the prophecy involving the Dark Lord's return for years and is now using it as evidence of his innocence, couldn't we use it as evidence of his guilt? Surely it is a crime to sit on vital information and not tell the proper authorities, or use it for his own gain while holding government positions. Cornelius Fudge's beady little eyes nearly popped out of his head at that revelation, and Chad couldn't help but want to see his reaction for when he innocently asked why the Keeper of the Hall of Prophecy had not just revealed the contents of the prophecy orb. After all, it didn't just appear on the shelf by itself. Someone needed to label the orb with the names of those involved after reviewing its contents. Of course, this would all be revealed with innocent questions from a curious Ravenclaw student while they waited for Madame Bones. If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.